Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. I don't really feel like doing a long-winded intro today, so let's just jump right into it. A long time ago, in a small kingdom in what is today modern Germany, there lived this poor miller, and for those at the back of the class, a miller is a guy who turns grain into flour. And one day this miller has to go meet with the king for some reason. Now, the miller being this poor peasant, he wanted to make a good impression on the king and make the king think that he's more important or more well off than he actually is. So during their meeting, he's boasting to the king that he has this beautiful daughter, and this daughter has a special gift. This daughter could sit down at a spinning wheel and spin straw into gold thread. And the king is like, nonsense, that's impossible, you're lying, you're making it up. But the miller insists my daughter can spin straw into gold thread. So the king calls him out on it. He says, well, you bring her to me and we will just see if she has this gift or not. And if she cannot spin straw into gold or refuses to do so, I will have her executed on the spot. So now the miller, he's stuck in between a rock and a hard place. He has no choice. So the next day he presents her to the king. The king, he summons his men and they take her to a room, and in this room there is a bundle of straw and a spinning wheel. And the king tells her that she is to spin all of the straw into gold thread. You have until daybreak the next morning to do it, and if you don't do it, you will be executed. The king then exits the room and locks the door himself, ensuring that nobody could get in or out. So this poor miller's daughter is sitting in this room and she has no idea how this task can be done. And late into the night she starts to weep when all of a sudden, seemingly out of the shadows, a little imp appears, and he says, "Good evening, Mrs. Miller. Why are you crying so?" And through her tears she begins to explain, my father boasted to the king that I have a special gift that I could spin straw into gold thread, but I have no such gift. I cannot do it, and the king will execute me in the morning. And the imp simply says, oh, that's easy, I can do that for you. However, you must give me something in exchange for this task. And she says, I have this necklace of glass beads, will you take this in exchange for the task? The imp says, deal, and he spins all the straw into gold thread. He finishes his task and he disappears just as quickly as he appeared. The next morning, the king unlocks the door, he walks into the room and he can't believe his eyes. All the straw is gone, and all around the room in the straw's place are all these bobbins just completely filled with gold thread. The king is elated at this. He's never seen such a magical feat before. However, the king is also a very greedy man, so while she was spending the night in this room, he was already preparing a larger room full of straw to be spun into gold. So he takes her from that first room into this larger room and says, you have one night to spin all this straw into gold now, and if you cannot do it or you refuse to do it, if this is all a big elaborate trick, you will be executed at daybreak. So once again she's shoved in this room and she's frantic. However, once again shortly after midnight the imp appears again and he says, same predicament? Well, I can spin all this straw into gold if you want. Easy task. What do you have to give me? To which she replies, I can give you this ring. It's glass, but you might like it. The imp takes the ring and once again he spins all the straw into gold thread. Just like before, he disappears, and at daybreak the king is elated once again. He can't believe his eyes. And at this time the king says, you may be a simple miller's daughter, but I can think of no one richer in the world. I'll tell you what, I'm going to take you to another room that I have prepared. It's filled with straw, it's much larger, and if you can spin all that straw into gold thread by daybreak, I will make you my wife and queen. So she's taken to an even larger room, and from the floor to the ceiling there's this huge stack of straw. And at this time, as soon as the door latches behind her, the little imp is there again. And he's standing there and he's like, looks like quite a predicament you've gotten yourself into now, so what do you give me to turn all of this straw into gold thread? And the girl starts to weep because she states, I have nothing left to give. So the little imp is like, well, I'm not entirely interested in material things. So how about this? I will spin this straw into gold. You will become the queen. But you must promise me your firstborn child after you are queen. She thinks about it for a little bit, and then she agrees that she will give up her firstborn child to this little imp if he does this task. The king, he comes back into the chamber once again, and once again he's surrounded by just piles of bobbins with gold thread on them. The king, being so astonished and elated at this, he instantly proposes marriage to the miller's daughter, to which she accepts on the condition that she never have to spin straw into gold again. And the king is like, "Madam, you have produced enough gold to make me richer than Midas himself. Of course, whatever you want." So they marry, she becomes queen, and about a year later they give birth to their first son. But the imp doesn't show up immediately. In fact, he doesn't really show up at all. And for the first several months of this child's life, there's no sign of this imp. And as time goes on, she doesn't even really think about the promise she made to the imp anymore. She's practically forgotten about the promise she's made to this imp. That is until the child's first birthday. So after all the fun and ceremony has kind of calmed down, the queen is alone in her room when she hears a familiar voice. It simply says, "Now give me what you promised me." Startled, she turns around, and out of the shadows once again the imp appears. And the queen, she says, "No, I can't. This is my son. I would rather give you all the treasures of the kingdom than give up my only child." In this moment, upon hearing that she's willing to give up everything in order to keep her child, the imp takes pity on her and makes her a deal. He says, "I will give you 3 days. Every day I will return, and if you can guess my name, you can keep your child. But if at the end of 3 days you have not guessed my name, the child will become mine." After this, the queen was in a bind, and she spent the entire night trying to think of every name that she can. And she sent out messengers to the villages of the kingdom to gather up all the names of all the people. So the next day, the imp returns, and he says, "Madam, guess my name." And she goes down the whole list. She spends all day reciting every name she can think of. However, after each guess, the imp replies, "That's not my name." The next day, she inquired to ask what all the servants were named, and she wanted all the wild, crazy names that they could come up with. So on the first day, she was saying things like, "Is your name Bill? Is your name John? Is your name George?" By the second day, she's down the list, and she's like, "Is your name Rib Roast, Sheepshanks, Spindleshanks?" And to every guess, the reply was the same: "That is not my name." So on the third day, at around dawn, one of her messenger shows back up, and initially he has bad news. He says, "Madam, I have been all over the villages and I cannot discover any new names. However, I do have an interesting tale. On my way back, as I passed through the woods, I came to a high hill, and near it was a little house, and before the house burned a fire, and round the fire danced a comical little man, and he hopped on one leg and cried, 'Today do I bake, tomorrow I brew.' The day after that the queen's child comes in, and oh, I am glad that nobody knew that the name I am called is Rumpelstiltskin." And after this, the queen just knows that this is his name, and I'm sure that that messenger was gifted with like a gold bobbin or something. So soon afterwards, the imp, he shows back up, and he says, "Now, Miss Queen, what is my name?" And just like before, the queen asks, "Is your name Jack?" "Madam, that's not my name." "Is your name Harry?" "Madam, that's not my name." At this moment, the queen sighed and said, "Well, I have been through every name I know. There's only one more name I can guess. Perhaps your name is Rumpelstiltskin." And at this moment, Rumpelstiltskin flew into a rage. He started jumping up and down, and he started to question the queen. "Who told you that? Was it a witch? Was it the devil? Fine, keep the kid. You win." And then there's 2 different endings depending on who's telling the tale. In the earlier endings, he simply just leaves in a rage. In later tellings, he stamps his foot so hard into the ground that when he tries to free it, he tears himself in 2 and dies. But that is the story of Rumpelstiltskin. This story, in its many iterations, is one one of the oldest folk tales to feature an imp, and according to researchers at Durham University and the Nova University Leipzig, origins of this story can be traced back to 4,000 years ago. And this same story pattern appears in cultures all over Europe and Asia. However, it's mostly associated with German or Germanic cultures. In fact, the word Rumpelstiltskin actually comes from an old German word. It literally means little rattle stilt. So think of like a stick or a handle on like a baby rattle. That's what it's referring to. Now, Rumpelstilt or Rumpelstilts was also the name of a type of goblin in Proto-Germanic folklore that was somewhat mischievous. It would come into your house and make noises by rattling on posts or rapping on planks. The meaning is also similar to another word, Rumpelgeist or rattle ghost, which is essentially what they would call a poltergeist. It's a mischievous spirit that comes into your home and like moves your shit around. But this is really the earliest iteration of a story we would see about an imp. Now, in some cultures it's a dwarf, in other cultures it's a mischievous spirit, but it lays the foundation for a lot of local lore around these creatures that would come. And while that story or tale can be broken down into many lessons, like don't be boastful or don't be greedy, the real point of the story comes with the whole nature surrounding the mystery of the imp's name, and it's actually called the Rumpelstiltskin principle. Now, this is still used today in modern psychology. However, even in these ancient times, there was this belief that to give or know the name of a true being is to have power over it. This is why the imp is so furious at the end of the tale. She derived his true name, so now she has power over him. And this idea is still kind of around today. In folklore dealing with fairy folk, which I'll get into later, you do not give your true name to a fae. It's kind of also why today you don't give your real name to people who are like sketchy or you don't really trust. That's why you don't give your real name to like, I don't know, your weed dealer or that guy who you bought that genuine Folex watch from. But I digress. So this tale is one of the earliest tales we hear about an imp. So what's an imp? Put bluntly, an imp is a European mythological being similar to that of a fairy or a demon, depending on the religious context of the time, I guess. Because, you know, Christianity, they put their little spin on everything and turned all the creatures from those folklores into demons. So unlike in Christian folklore, demons in Germanic legends were not necessarily always evil. Most of the time, they were generally more mischievous. Their behavior is described as being wild or uncontrollable, much like fairies. In some cultures, they're interchangeable with fairies. It wasn't until more modern times when fairies were more associated with, I don't know, being good. But to be honest, I think a lot of that comes from like Disney and art. But they're considered to be free spirits, true anarchists who just enjoy the pursuit of all things fun. They're pranksters, they like misleading people, they're mischievous, and a lot of times the pranks are harmless fun. However, there is a dark side. Some of the pranks are a little more harmful, like leading people astray in the woods or switching babies at birth, but all of this is literally done just for the imp's own entertainment. They don't really have a motive. It's just like, hey, let's do this and see what happens. I bet it'll be hilarious. It's literally where we get the term impish behavior from. Now, imps are generally depicted as being small in stature and not very attractive. They're often portrayed as lonely little creatures in search of human attention, often through using jokes and pranks to attract human friendship. However, you better have the energy to keep up with them because they just go all out 24/7, it seems like, which just ultimately leads to the imp becoming lonely because he takes his pranks or whatever too far. They usually backfire, and then the people are like, I don't want to be your friend anymore. Fuck off, dude. Now, post-Christian Europe, imps, they kind of go from being these mischievous little pranksters to being the familiars of witches. They were said to be the spies and informants for the witches, so the witches could have, I don't know, information about who they're going to put a spell on or whatever. So they get heavily demonized, and this is where we kind of see that split between the evil imp and the good fairies. Now, in some folklores, the imps are also described as being bound or contained by some sort of object. Sometimes it's a crystal ball, sometimes it's a ring or a book or a glass bottle, and they're kind of kept in these objects until they are summoned by, I guess, their master. creature who needs them. And that really gives rise to that modern day idea of a genie. Just look at the hit show from the 60s, I Dream of Jeannie. She was bound by her master in this glass bottle. So they're really like the proto-Germanic folklore that kind of explodes into all these different things. And the general crux of all these things is they're little people. They're usually supernatural in nature or not quite human. They're usually of very small stature. They usually live in some kind of unseen realm, or they live out in the woods or in like side of a tree or in a rock. They're usually hidden folk. Some of them may only appear at night. Some of them may never appear. Some of them are helpful. Some of them are craftsmen. And some of them are just mischievous, crazy anarchists. And it seems like there are a lot of cultures around the world that have this kind of mythological, tiny humanoid being. So let's move away from imps. I really just wanted to start with imps because that idea kind of lays the foundation for the rest of this. And let's move on to some of the more derivative stuff that came out of this idea. So obviously I'm going to talk about leprechauns, because why the hell not? Leprechauns are kind of the most iconic of the Irish imps. Now, Irish folklore, if you dive into that, it is a completely wild ride of various rabbit holes with tons of supernatural creatures. So we're not going to do a deep dive into Irish folklore here. We're just going to kind of do what I did back in that How to Make a Zombie episode back in season 2. Go check it out. I'm just going to touch on the one aspect of this folklore. And to be honest, the leprechaun is a really late addition to Irish mythology. It's not until the 8th century, so 700s AD, where we first see a depiction of a leprechaun in any kind of Irish literature. And we have to remember 700 AD, that is about 300 or 400 years post-Christian contact with Ireland. So it is highly possible that there's a lot of Christian influence behind the depictions and creation of the leprechaun as we know it today. Now, despite the leprechaun sharing a lot of characteristics that we see with the imp, such as being solitary or being a mischievous prankster, they're not really classified as imps. They're generally grouped with fairies or sprites or pixies. And I think that's just because post-Christianity, imps were more associated with demonic creatures. But the leprechaun is something that is truly of Irish origin. Now, they're basically solitary creatures who are found in like moors and forests and caves and gardens. They're usually depicted as little bearded men who wear a coat and a hat and partake in mischief. And it was in later times when they were depicted as shoemakers, and they get associated with hiding pots of gold at the end of rainbows. Now, these pots of gold have a historic origin. They refer to treasure crocks. Now, treasure crocks are an actual archaeological phenomenon, and the analysis we get from these can determine times of strife or war in the area. So it's literally what the myth is. It is a pot of gold. Of course, sometimes it's not always gold. Sometimes it is just the coinage that the locals were using. So basically what happens is there's a time of war or a time of strife or whatever. You're in your little village, and let's say your army's moved out and the invading army's coming in, and you want to get the hell out of Dodge because you don't want to become the slaves to this invading army. But you can't just pack up everything and leave, so what you do is you take a little bit of coin for your journey, and then the rest of your money, your valuables, your shit that you don't want the invading army to find, you shove that in like a clay jar or whatever, and you bury it in the ground. Now, the ones that we do find in the archaeological record, we know what happened there. They never came back for those. Most likely because they were killed or captured by that invading army, and they never got the chance to retrieve their shit. And this is a common practice that humans do all over the world, and it kind of gives rise to that whole idea of buried treasure. So where do leprechauns in Ireland play into this? So as we know throughout history, Ireland has constantly been invaded. There has been war and strife throughout much of its history. Most of that pain and suffering was at the hands of the Vikings and the British, but I digress. But it's natural that during these times of strife and war that the Irish people would have created these treasure crocks from time to time, and they were unable to return to them. And leprechauns, pretty much being able to go wherever they want, have naturally come across these treasure crocks, and they claim them for their own. Because, you know, finders keepers. And since the original owners are dead, it's like, who cares? So that's where leprechauns generally get their wealth. Now, that part of it is a really modern part of the folklore. That didn't come onto the scene until around the 19th century. And to be honest, a lot of depictions and stories around leprechauns are fairly modern. They mostly come up in and around the 19th and 20th centuries. But let's quickly skip back to the earliest accounts we see of leprechauns in Ireland. This account actually comes from The Adventure of Fergus, son of Leti. And this is an 8th century saga, kind of like a poetic saga. And there's a chapter which tells a tale in which Fergus mac Leti, king of Ulster, he falls asleep on the beach and wakes to find himself being dragged into the sea by 3 leprechauns. Upon awakening, he manages to capture these 3 abductors, and in exchange for their release, they grant him 3 wishes. And we can already see in this that idea of the genie who grants wishes, which folds back into that imp folklore. Of course, by the time we get to the 19th century, the folklore has changed to that they're simply mischievous pranksters who can't really be trusted. They're tricksters. They'll promise you great wealth, but then they'll trick you in some fashion. For example, in one story, a young man, he comes across a leprechaun, and in exchange for his release, he tells his captor, "I will take you to where I've buried this pot of gold." The young man agrees, and the leprechaun walks him into this grove of trees. And the leprechaun, he points to a tree and he says, "Buried under the roots of that tree is my gold. You can have it if you release me." Now the young man, realizing that he doesn't have a spade to dig with, takes this red ribbon that he has and he ties it around this tree, effectively marking it so he knows which tree to go to when he comes back to this area. He tells the leprechaun, "I'm off to fetch a spade, you're free to go." So he comes back with his spade and the leprechaun is gone, and he begins searching for the tree with the ribbon tied around it. However, when he walks back to that area, he sees that every tree now has a red ribbon tied around it. The man digs and digs and digs under every single tree. However, he is never able to find the gold. And despite many attempts to seek out this leprechaun and capture him again, the man is never successful. He never sees the leprechaun again, which is a big reason why a lot of people will tell you to exercise caution if you ever capture or interact with a leprechaun. They will trick you. And they don't do it out of malice or ill intent or anything. They're simply doing it for the fun of messing with people. And this is because a leprechaun can be considered a true neutral or maybe a chaotic neutral type of character. It was stated by David Russell McAnally that the leprechaun is the son of an evil spirit and a degenerate fairy and is not wholly good nor wholly evil. So essentially he's somewhere in between, that gray area between good and evil. Now we see countless depictions of people interacting with leprechauns, but say you wanted to interact with a leprechaun, where would you go? Well, it's pretty much anywhere and everywhere in Ireland. However, depending on wherever you go in Ireland, there's gonna be different appearances. For example, the modern idea of a leprechaun completely dressed in green is really a post-20th century thing. And to be perfectly blunt, it's really an American idea. Before this idea really took off, leprechauns were mostly depicted as wearing red. And according to McAnally, the universal leprechaun is described as follows. He is about 3 feet high and is dressed in a little red jacket or a roundabout with red breeches buckled at the knee, gray or black stockings, and a hat cocked in the style of a century ago, over a little old withered face. Round his neck is an Elizabethan ruff and frills of lace are at his wrists. On the wild west coast, where the Atlantic winds bring almost constant rains, he dispenses with the ruff and frills and wears a frizz overcoat. And the dress varies by region. So for example, the northern leprechaun usually wore a military red coat and white breeches with a broad-brimmed high-pointed hat on which he would sometimes stand upside down, which kind of sounds like a British military uniform almost. In and around Tipperary, they're found wearing a slashed red jacket and a jockey cap while also sporting a sword or a magic wand. And in and around Monaghan, they wore a swallow-tailed evening coat of red with a green vest, white breeches, black stockings, shiny shoes, and a long cone hat without a brim. And these are just some of the numerous variants we see coming out of leprechaun lore. And to be honest, I really just focus on the ones that I saw when I threw the word leprechaun into Wikipedia. Now, as I said, the color green is a wholly modern invention. A lot of people believe that leprechauns took on the color green in the 20th century because that color is associated with like Irish nationalism. And to be honest, in the folklore, there's nothing to really be said about the four-leaf clover. I believe that's also an American modern invention. But the leprechaun has gone down in history, modern history, as kind of being a symbol for Ireland, sometimes in a negative stereotypical light, but more recently he's been depicted as kind of like a, I don't know, symbol for tourism, I guess. But at the end of the day, myself personally, I think the leprechaun is basically an evolution on the mythology around imps, simply because it just shares a lot of those same similarities we come out of that older Germanic legend as it spread, north and west and east and wherever. Because there's a general myth in a lot of this folklore that all of this stuff can trace its origins back to some of these proto-Germanic religions. And naturally, as they spread, they change, especially when those beliefs spin off into different cultures. Which brings us back to those proto-Germanic, proto-Scandinavian cultures and into our next topic, dwarves. Now, dwarves, we all know what dwarves are. They're the iconic little folk. They're generally depicted to be this culture of smiths or craftsmen. A lot of them are depicted as miners. They're known to live their entire lives underground in caves and mountains, mining the precious ores and stones which make them extremely wealthy. Now, they feature heavily in Old Norse sources. However, depictions of them are very vague. Very early depictions describe them as a formless spirit, and it's much later in the Prose Edda where we see the first kind of depictions of dwarves as human-like figures. Now, based on where you are, descriptions are kind of all over the place, but generally they're short in stature. They're almost exclusively male. Every one of them is depicted as having a long beard. And they're typically highly industrious. And this is especially depicted in the Eddic sources where they are depicted as creating magical treasures for the gods. So Thor's hammer Mjolnir, for example, it was created by dwarves. Also Brisingamen, which is the torque or necklace of the goddess Freya. Dwarves are also seen as the forgers of the spear Gungnir, which is the spear of the god Odin, which is said to always hit its target. And these are just a few amongst many other magical items that show up in tales involving dwarves. Now, the mining part of the legend comes from a couple of different sources and even some Germanic legends. In this one part of the Poetic Edda, in a chapter called the Voluspa, and I thought Russian words were hard to say, it's recorded that dwarves were produced out of the earth. They were masters of the rocks and stone. Terry Pratchett, in his satire series Discworld, dives really deep into some of these dwarf myths and legends, and he puts a really clever spin on it. Essentially, the original dwarf hatched out of this stone egg alongside a troll and a human inside of this cave, and while the human wandered outside and became enlightened, the dwarf wandered back further into the cave and became endarkened. Now, that book series is an ultra-modern fantasy concerning a whole trope of legends and sagas and so on and so forth, but it's a really cool narrative that adds to the lore of the whole thing. But now I'm off on a tangent now about the Discworld book series, so let's get back into the real world. So in German legends, dwarves are typically depicted as living inside of hollow mountains or hollow rocks, and some even live in individual stones which serve as their workshops. And it's said that this idea even goes into modern folklore today. There are certain places, especially in Europe and across Iceland, where you don't disturb certain features in the landscape. You'll see a road and you'll see like a boulder, and then you'll see the road go around the boulder, and you might think, why didn't they just move the boulder? Well, it's because in some lore, some ancient lore usually handed down over generations, that's considered to be like a dwarf stone. and to move it would be considered disrespectful to the dwarf inhabitant and could possibly bring bad luck and misfortune to you. And there's another cool little, I guess, side theory or interpretation about why dwarves are associated with living in mountains or in stone, and it actually harkens back to my Hollow Earth episode back in season 1. Go check it out. It's a very short episode and it's actually one of my most popular. It's always in my top 10, even though the editing on that was very primitive. Hell, I didn't even know how to cut out background noise yet. But it's this proposal that goes back to that ancient idea of humans dumping other humans into the back of a cave via a funeral ritual. And this idea comes from a man named Lot Motz. Now, this guy is a true to the bone Germanic folklorist, so he usually knows what he's talking about. The dude's written something like 4 books and has published tons of scholarly papers about Germanic mythology and folklore. And in one of his publications, he proposes that the inhabitation of mountains, stones, and mounds by dwarves may be derived from their earlier association with the dead, who are frequently buried in mounds and around megaliths. So that ancient practice where humans were dumping other humans into the back of caves once they died, which started out as a mundane task but then became associated with funerary rites, and eventually associated with this idea of the underworld, or the other world, had over time evolved into this idea of this society of dwarves living in mountains and rocks. And that might explain why early accounts of dwarves see them as kind of a shapeless spirit, and usually associated with disease and spreading disease, before they later evolve into what we see in the Germanic and Norse sagas, where they become little industrious people who make magic objects for the gods and whatnot. Of course, the most popular depiction of dwarves, which makes it into our modern folklore, is the Germanic folktale Snow White. Now, Snow White is a very old Germanic fairy tale. However, the first time we really see it written down is when the Grimm brothers were releasing their 1812 volume of all the folktales they were gathering. And we all know who the Grimms are. The Grimms were on this kind of mission in order to gather up all the various folktales of all around Germany and compile them into this series of books. And Snow White is a really awesome tale. It lays a lot of foundations of what we would think of when we think of the modern idea of a fairy tale. So it features such elements as the magic mirror, the poisoned apple, the glass coffin, the character, the evil queen, and of course, a depiction of dwarves. And in this tale, they are already depicted as highly industrious, tiny people who exclusively mine and mine for gold. And I actually have an original 1812 copy of that fairy tale in my collection. Now, I'm not going to recite the whole thing here like I recited that Rumpelstiltskin tale, but I did record a recitation of that. So if you want to hear it, maybe it'll be a bonus episode. I don't know yet. Now, to be honest, that's really all there is to say about dwarves in that kind of Germanic Scandinavian sense without really deep diving down into some esoteric Norse mythology with words that I can't even begin to pronounce. But hey, maybe I'll dedicate some future episodes to that, I don't know. However, dwarves and imps really have nothing on the folklore surrounding fairies. Now, I'm not going to deep dive into fairies here, but I'll just give a very general overview because there's enough source material and rabbit holes where I can make an entire series just dedicated to this one subject. So put very basically, a fairy or a fae or fairfolk is a type of mythical anthropomorphic being which is found in folklore all over Europe, going all the way back to like ancient Greece and probably even further than that. And the origin is very similar to that origin story of an imp. It's like a spirit type creature. They're thought to have magical powers. They're thought to be tricksters. Some cultures associate them with their gods. To be honest, the term itself is this kind of catch-all umbrella term for all these other creatures. However, when we think of a fairy, we think of that traditional kind of Greek idea or that modern idea of like Tinkerbell, for example. But when you look into the folklore, the recurring motif of the legends about fairies is the need to ward them off with protective charms, so particularly iron. So hanging a horseshoe above your threshold, not only was that a way for good luck, but the iron horseshoe was to ward off fairies. Fairies in these days were associated with sickness and spreading illness, particularly tuberculosis, which spread amongst children like wildfire in these days. Some other charms that would ward off fairies would be church bells or four-leaf clovers, which I think that's mostly associated with leprechauns, but it's in the literature. And the idea is you want to ward them off because they're out there to create mischief. They're out to trick you. Some of them are even more sinister. They're out to kidnap you or kill you. There are instances of fairies swapping out a mother's child with a child of their own, so that child is raised in the human world, and that's believed to be where green eyes come from. So basically, if you have green eyes like I do, it means you're descended from the Fae and may have some magical or mystical powers. Of course, given my ancestry, I think our superpower is just the power to screw things up, but I digress. And a lot of them are depicted to be very beautiful, very fair, very angelic looking. That's where you get the idea of the wings. It's believed that this depiction actually goes back to the Achaemenid Empire. So this idea is coming from Persian folklore, which today that would be in and around Iran. In this folklore, they had a creature called Peris, which were renowned for their beauty, and it's believed that, you had trade between like them and ancient Greece, so with trade comes cultural exchange, so over the generations as that makes its way west, it gets absorbed into other Western folklores. And this is also true of like, for example, Scandinavian elves. They're believed to have influenced folklore around fairies, due to the fact that the Scandinavians literally went everywhere and traded everywhere and raided everywhere. So anywhere we see a mixing of cultures, we're going to see a mixing of folklores, and it's going to lead to the rise of entities like fairies. And don't worry, if you want to hear more about that topic, I do plan on creating several episodes in the future about this topic because it gets really deep. But to be honest, I'm mostly just sick of talking about Europe, so let's move somewhere else in the world. Let's go to the Americas, because Native American folklore is very rich in this idea of little people. And it's kind of funny because a lot of this folklore actually kind of mirrors what's going on in folklore around the rest of the world. So for example, here in North America, around the Great Lakes region, there were legends told of a race of little people who lived in the woods near sandy hills and sometimes near rocks located along the Great Lakes. And these little people are depicted on petroglyphs, which show them with having horns on their heads, traveling in groups of about 5 to 7 in canoes. And just like in other cultures around the world, these people were pranksters, they were tricksters. They would do things such as sing and then hide when an inquisitive person would search for the music, so it would lead them astray in the woods. It's also frequently said that these little people, they would take children away from bad or abusive parents and raise them as their own. Other legends would state that these people, if seen by an adult human, they would actually beg them not to say anything of their existence, and if they kept their word, they would reward them during a time of need. And there are different variations of this same kind of general idea across the North American continent. This wasn't just relegated to like one tribe or one region, this was kind of universal. And just like dwarves, there are tales of these people living in caves, and these people were not to be disturbed, so these caves were not to be entered. And even during the Lewis and Clark expedition, they reported in their journals that Native Americans in the vicinity of Spirit Mound in South Dakota, they held a belief that within this mound resided a race of little people. And despite all the persuasion in the world, the expedition party, they could not convince these local Native Americans to go anywhere near that mound. They were basically like, nope, too dangerous, not gonna fuck with these guys. And the Crow, they believe in this race of people called the Nairumbi, or the Awawaki, who lived in the Pryor Mountains in Montana, and this was essentially a race of ferocious dwarves, who are also crucial in imparting spiritual wisdom. And it's said that they played a role in kind of shaping the destiny of the Crow culture through the dreams of the iconic Crow chief Plenty Coups. So these people are said to be no more than 18 inches or 46 centimeters tall. They're depicted as having large round bellies, short strong arms, and little to no neck. They have many sharp sharp canine teeth. They only eat meat and are known as fierce warriors. And it was believed that anyone who would play a trick on these little people would incur their wrath, which would involve the little people killing their entire family. And every year at Medicine Rocks, they would offer up, offerings to these little people, which would appease them. It was often said that in exchange for this, the little people, they would confer blessings or impart spiritual insight. So the crux of the general story goes that on occasion, a lone crow warrior would travel to Medicine Rocks and fast, during which time one of these little people would manifest, usually in the form of a lone solitary animal, and impart some kind of wisdom onto this warrior. Now, one person that these little people imparted their wisdom on was Chief Many Coos. Many Coos, he had 2 encounters with the little people, once when he was 9 and once when he was 11. So in the first of these encounters, Plenty Coos had a vision that the chief of the little people took him to his spirit lodge. And the dwarf chief demanded that Plenty Coos count coup. And for context, we need to know what counting coup is. So this is something that happens in some Native American warrior cultures, primarily among peoples of the Plains region. It was a way to intimidate or show bravery when confronting an enemy, sometimes to the point where the enemy would be persuaded to admit defeat without actually being killed. It was considered a great accomplishment, a great feat, an act of prestige. So it mostly comes in the form of a non-lethal blow struck against an enemy that counts as a coup. In some cultures, riding up to an enemy and touching him on the shoulder with a stick and going off unscathed, that counts as a coup. And sometimes in some of these cultures, counting coup was considered more important than killing the enemy. This was considered an ultimate act of bravery, walking up to a warrior and tapping him on the shoulder in the heat of battle without killing him is basically saying, I don't fear you, I am a brave warrior. So back to Counting Coos in our story. Well, Counting Coos is only 9 and he doesn't have any great tales or victories that he can really brag about or boast about at this time. However, at this time, the chief of the little people spoke out to the other spirits in this lodge and states that Plenty Coos has 2 great deeds that he can boast about. 1, he would become chief of his people if he used his wits, and 2, that he would develop his willpower and lead his people into, a new tomorrow or something. So a couple years go by, and Plenty Coos and his family, they move to be with other bands of crow lodging in the Beartooth Mountains. And during this time, he goes on another long, arduous vision quest, during which time he doesn't have any vision, so he cuts off the tip of one of his fingers as an offering to the little people, and this works. So that night, he dreams of the chief of the little people again, and the chief introduces him to this man with buffalo-like features that he called the Buffalo Man. And the man leads Plenty Coos down this tunnel under Pryor Mountain into the bowels of the earth. He follows him for 2 days among throngs of American bison that are just kind of stampeding out of this tunnel but then disappearing. Next, a second stream of bison with different colors, spots, tails, and sounds came up out of the ground and remained on the plains. He then sees himself as an old man lodged near Medicine Rocks and a vast forest whose trees had been felled by a great wind. Only a chickadee remained. At this time, a voice, like an ominous voice out of nowhere, told Plenty Coos that the day of the Plains Indian was ending and that the white man would swarm over the land like buffalo, but the chickadee remains because it is a good listener, develop its mind, and surveys its wits. So Plenty Coos, he goes to the tribal elders to interpret this dream, and they tell him that this meant that the buffalo would soon disappear, which almost did happen because at this time, American hunters had almost driven the buffalo to extinction, and it's only in recent decades when those herds are really starting to come back. He said that the buffalo would disappear to be replaced by the white man's cattle, but the Crow people would survive the oncoming tide of the white man if the people would develop their listening skills and minds, and that the Crow people would inherit the land around Medicine Rocks. Now, guided by these prophecies, Plenty Coos would become a chief and tribal leader within the Crow, and the Crow Nation would survive, and that land today is the Crow Indian Reservation. And it was because of these visions and the guiding wisdom of Plenty Coos, which was why the Crow Nation still survives to this day. And to be honest, that's one of my favorite stories of little people in North America. And it's just one of the many stories out there that depict little people and their magical abilities. Now, staying on the North American continent, but moving south into the Yucatan Peninsula, we come across the Alux. This was a type of sprite or spirit in the tradition of a lot of Mayan and Mayan descended people. So the Alux, or plural Aluxob, are small creatures, generally about 40 centimeters high, and appear in the traditional dress of Maya people. They are generally invisible, but they will assume physical form in order to communicate or scare off humans or congregate. They're generally associated with natural features such as forests, caves, stones, and fields, but can be enticed to move somewhere through offerings. One thing they will do is they will protect your property and they will protect your corn or maize. And we have to remember that maize had a very sacred status amongst many of these people in and around Mexico at the time. For good reason, it's their primary staple crop. So with a large population, you want to protect that at all costs. Simply put, a bad harvest will mean famine. So some Maya believe that the Alexob are called into being when a farmer builds a little house on his property, most often in a maize field. And for the first 7 years, this Alux, he basically hangs around the farm. He helps the corn grow. He summons rain. He patrols the fields at night. He whistles to scare off predators or crop thieves. So he's one of these helpful entities. However, this only lasts for 7 years because at the end of 7 years, the farmer must close the windows and doors of the little house, sealing the Alux inside. If this is not done, the Alux gets bored and runs wild and starts playing tricks on people. Now, some other folktales in the region state that they will occasionally take human form and they would stop and ask farmers or travelers for an offering. And if the farmer or traveler or whatever gives them that offering, they will bring them good luck and protect them from thieves on their travels. However, if they refuse, they basically incur its wrath. They will wreak havoc and spread illness. So it's best to treat them with respect. Now, in a lot of folklores, there are two camps as to where this one came from. And these two camps are, was it pre-Columbian or post-Columbian when this idea came up? Some people believe it's pre-Columbian. Other people believe that it came from post-Spanish and post-British contact. Some people believe that it came from pirates operating around the coasts at this time who were British in origin, who had deep beliefs in things like fairies and sprites, and it kind of got absorbed into the culture. I'm not really in that camp. I think it's an independent thing. I think it predates that contact, especially when you think of its association with maize, which generally had some sacredness when it came to this culture. And the fact that descendants of the Mayan culture state that these are spirits of their ancestors. And that belief is handed down through oral tradition, and as we've seen historically on this show, oral tradition rarely ever changes. It may evolve, but usually the core truth is still there. So let's shift gears and head to somewhere else, one of my favorite places in the world, the South Pacific, specifically Hawaii, which, to be honest, I recently just found out that real estate prices for just undeveloped land are extremely affordable. Now, I am aware that that's offset by the remoteness and the high cost of living, but it's enticing. But anyway, even Hawaiian folklore has a race of dwarf-like people who live in the mountains. They're called the Menehune. And there are a few different theories as to where tales of the Menehune came from, but I'll get into that later. So the Menehune are another one of these builder entities. They're a race of dwarf people who are said to live deep in the forests and hidden valleys of the Hawaiian Islands, hidden away from human settlements. And like a lot of dwarves that we see contemporary in Europe, they're said to be excellent craftsmen. They're highly industrious. They've built temples, fish ponds, roads, canoes, and houses, and some of these structures that are attributed to the Menehune still exist. For example, on the island of Kauai, there is this fish pond called Alacoco, which was believed to have been built by the Menehune in one night. Now, the pond was built at a large bend in the Hulei River. Hawaiians, don't hate me, I'm from Ohio, I'm trying. So this pond was created when they essentially went to this bend of this river, and they created a 900-foot long rock wall. It is the largest fish pond on Kauai, and it was believed to have been built in the 15th century. And when asked by, outsiders, other people coming to the island who built this fish pond, the Hawaiian people would say the Menehune built it. Now, the legend states that the Menehune only appear at night in order to build these masterpieces, and if they do not finish the masterpiece by daybreak, they abandon it, essentially. However, you would be hard-pressed to ever see or meet a Menehune because only their children or humans who are connected to them in some kind of way are the only ones that they make themselves visible to. Now, the Menehune, they are said to have already been on the Hawaiian Islands when the Hawaiians first settled these islands, and that they were essentially displaced by the Hawaiian settlers. And this kind of creates a lot of questions about the early settlement of Hawaii. Now, we know that archaeologically speaking, Hawaii was settled no later than 800 AD. Some people think it occurred as early as 400, but we know there were separate waves of migration coming in, 2 specifically. So the first wave most likely came from the Marquesas Islands. They're an island chain in the South Pacific and French Polynesia. And like I said, a lot of people believe this happened as early as 300 CE. I think it was much later. I think it was sometime around 800. So like all Polynesians, when they reach a new landmass or island, they brought with them an entire ecological system in their canoes. So these early settlers, they would establish their settlements along the coast and in the larger valleys, and they brought with them such plants as taro, banana, coconut, breadfruit, pork, chicken, and the poe dog, which is an extinct breed of dog from Hawaii. And naturally, they brought their own religions and traditions, which would develop all over Polynesia with them. And then they built their settlements and their fish ponds, and they were good to go. But it's not believed that Hawaiian culture really kicks off until this second migration comes through, and this migration was people from most likely Tahiti, which is also in French Polynesia, but it's a different island chain. And it's believed that when this second wave came, there was conflict and war. And it was the second wave that drove this first wave of settlers into the hills and mountains, and they became the Menehune. Now, a lot of that is speculation, but Menehune is a word with a very specific meaning. It basically means commoner. And this kind of makes sense because Hawaiian culture, they had a caste system. And it was a very strict caste system, and it was believed that this caste system was brought in by the second wave. And proponents of this hypothesis who believe that the Menehune were people who were displaced by this second wave of Hawaiian settlers, they usually report to a census which was taking place in 1820 on Kauai, in which 65 people are listed as Menehune, or people of this, I guess, social class, which could potentially be descendants from that first wave of settlement. And it seems to kind of make sense on Kauai. Kauai has always been considered somewhat independent throughout much of Hawaii's history, and it's believed that the island of Kauai was one of the last kind of holdouts of the early settlers, that first wave that came in. And Kauai is still heavily associated with the Menehune today. And a lot of people think that the folklore behind it, where they become little people, is another post-European contact thing. It comes from the post-European belief in fairies and whatnot. And that's probably possible, but, you know, when you look at the term Menehune, it means like commoner or small person. It's probably one of those words that kind of got spun where it was originally associated with the lower caste, and then this influence of like European folk tales comes in, and now it's associated with physical size. That's a possibility. But there is another hypothesis that's out there that's really wild, and I love it because it comes from this Polynesian connection, and it's thought that this dwarf-sized human myth comes from an ancient holdover in our folklore. And when I say ancient, I mean almost as far back as 50 to 100,000 years ago. And this brings us to the island of Flores in Indonesia. Now, while the Polynesian, I guess, kind of homeland is kind of centered around like New Zealand up to Hawaii, over to Easter Island. The further you go east, or in this case west, you get into Micronesia, Melanesia, and Southeast Asia, where we see the island of Flores. Now, humans had primarily migrated to these islands thousands of years ago, down through this chain, and eventually to New Zealand and Polynesia. And obviously, some of the ancient ancestors of these people probably would have come through Indonesia at the time. And these ancestors would have most likely interacted with a small archaic human known as Homo florensis. And I can't believe that I'm 70 something episodes in and I'm just now talking about Homo florensis. But I don't get to talk about wild fringe theories coming out of Polynesia a lot, so let's go with it. So Homo florensis is also known as the Hobbit. And yes, it gets its name from Tolkien's hit book, The Hobbit. Put bluntly, the Hobbit was a small human that inhabited the island of Flores until the arrival of modern humans about 50,000 years ago. So it would have interacted with the ancestor cultures which were coming into South Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and eventually Polynesia. Now, Homo florensis is one of these offshoot species of humans. Now, there is some speculative debate over the ancestor species of Homo florensis. Some people think it was Homo habilis, some think it was Homo erectus. Given the fact that this creature was a tool user, I'm gonna go with its ancestor species was probably Homo habilis. But what really sets Florensis apart was its small stature. It only stood 1.06 meters. 1.06 meters, that's 3'6" for us here in the real world. And the fact that they survive up until about 50,000 years ago, so they would have interacted with modern humans coming through. And there's this idea of maybe a wave of modern humans coming through, interacting with these creatures, and then spinning their own folk tales about these creatures and what they are, and then that gets handed down through the ages, ends up being the folk tales of the Menehune in Hawaii. And that really seems to be a common theme when you dig into some of the histories of these folk tales, or you start to speculate on where they came from. You find that sometimes they might have a more ancient link. And to be honest, at this point, I have only just barely scratched the surface of some of these folk tales involving little folk, or imps, or fairies, or dwarves, or whatever. And there are tales of these type of folk pretty much anywhere you go on the planet. So maybe sometime down the line, I'll do another episode focusing on some other of these little folk from other cultures. However, I do believe that this is where I'm going to end it for now. And I know this is another one of those episodes where I tackle a whole bunch of different topics or stories all at once. Normally those don't really do well, but we'll see how well this one does. But if you like it, give it a like, give it a follow, whatever. Go check it out on the socials. If you want, the YouTube page still exists. I don't do anything with it. It's just a re-upload. But if you want to follow it, I think there's 10 or 15 people following it for some reason. As always, you can support me directly and monetarily by clicking that link in the description of every episode. And if you do want to go that route, but you don't want your credit card information online, I work in finance, I get it. Reach out to me directly. Let me know that you want to donate to the show, and I will just simply give you my Cash App information. That seems to be the easiest way that people are doing it now. And for those people that do that, you guys truly are rock stars. I do have plans to kind of reward you guys in the future with that. However, my life is a chaotic mess right now. So once that kind of calms down, we'll look into that. As always, I do thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.